Hello everyone and welcome back to another online lesson for the Cold War course. Today we are going to look at the impact of the atomic bomb on US-Soviet relations, okay? So remember at this point we're still in the Grand Alliance, World War II has finished, and then this bomb has been dropped which has changed the world forever. This lesson will also focus on the telegrams that both sides sent to their respective leaders, and then we'll talk a little bit about how important that was for developing the Cold War. And breaking down these relations. So let's get straight into this lesson then with a bit of an overview of where we are. So although the Grand Alliance has generally been good during the Cold War conferences, World War II conferences, there was a few little sort of signs that relations were starting to break down, especially at Potsdam when Truman's rocked up and they clearly do not get on as well as perhaps Stalin and Roosevelt did. But anyway, by the end of Potsdam, we've made some significant agreements. Berlin was going to be split into four, but there were also some disagreements about, Soviet influence in the East, especially in Poland. So relations are tense, shall we say, but still together. All right. Stalin has come out of Potsdam, and it's very clear that he wants to control Eastern Europe to protect the Soviet Union. The word protect is important there, particularly for next lesson when we look at the creation of the satellite states. Whereas for Truman, he believes that Stalin is trying to spread communism west, which has begun to affect trust in the Grand Alliance. So this paranoia of Truman is sort of reinforcing his policy, I guess. And as we see as this Cold War course develops, this is where we're going to be. Okay, so very quickly, this alliance has now started to turn into a little bit of hostility in peacetime. So just to get things straight, as we're about to look at the atomic bomb being dropped on Japan, that Truman has tested this bomb on the second day of the Potsdam conference. He waited till the conference, I believe, to show how much power he had and to try and, I guess, leverage dominance in this Potsdam peace conference. But don't confuse the idea that they dropped the bomb on Japan during Potsdam. We'll talk about that in a sec, but that's an important thing. The test that he did on the second day of the conference was a test at home in America, but obviously Stalin was still upset by that because Truman hadn't told him about it, and Stalin found out pretty much when everyone else did that America has this super weapon. All right, so just think about this bombing of Hiroshima then in Japan and then Nagasaki a couple of days later. Why would this new weapon change the world forever? And also then why would displaying its power like this on Japan give the United States an advantage as a world power? So pause the video and answer those two questions in your book or in your Google Doc, wherever you're doing these notes. And then when you're ready, obviously unpause as always, and we'll carry on with the lesson. Okay, so this bomb that they dropped on Japan killed 120,000 civilians in an instant. Like nothing had ever been seen by humans before, no weapon ever so destructive. 120,000 people killed in an instant, probably even quicker than in an instant. It's been argued, and this is where the sort of tensions come as a little bit of dropping this bomb on both sides, criticising Truman as well as praising him, that it's been argued the USA could have easily defeated Japan without using this bomb. It's been claimed they only did it to give them some superiority over the Soviet Union in future negotiations, and there's probably an element of truth to that. So perhaps, we might have been arguing in class a little bit if you are watching this because you missed the lesson, that the first bomb, maybe nobody knew really what it would do, but the second bomb a few days later, when everybody knew what it would do, perhaps that's the one that sort of crosses the line if you are against Truman or not for dropping this bomb. Either way, the fact of the matter is that Truman dropped the bomb twice on Japan, which has basically shook the world and shook Stalin and shook this Grand Alliance and the relations to the very core. Partly because Stalin felt they were an alliance and should have communicated this a little bit more. But also don't forget that Stalin had agreed to attack Japan after the war in Europe was over back at Tehran. So now that the Americans have sort of ended the war in Japan, whereas Stalin was supposed to do this, again you can see a lack of trust and a clear reasoning for a breakdown of relations and friendship, if that was ever such a word. So that's an important part to think about as we go on to the story. Going into Potsdam, we're having tested the bomb on day 2. Truman certainly will have felt more confident that he could control all of the agreements, particularly what was happening in Eastern Europe. All right, so Truman is very much, remember, in panic mode, fear mode, that Stalin will start influencing, taking over Eastern Europe. Whereas before Truman came along at Yalta, it was sort of agreed generally that Russia could influence Eastern Europe because they'd helped free them from the Nazis. So Truman brought this whole new perspective, didn't he, to the conferences, which in itself began affecting relations. But we've already talked about that in a previous lesson. All right, if you are watching this as a revision video in year 11, then that's important to remind yourself just a little bit about that. All right, so the bomb's been dropped on Japan. America is looking very strong. Stalin is looking very worried. We'll just have a little look briefly now at some of the impact of the atomic bomb. You can see here that beneath the explosion, steel and concrete was just completely melted. This is a photograph of Hiroshima afterwards. 75,000 people incinerated in seconds. You can see from this photograph, the whole place has generally been flattened. There's not an awful lot left, is there? If you look really, really carefully. Some other photographs, we can see that at 8:15, this pocket watch stopped working. There's no glass in any of the buildings that you can see in the right-hand side photograph. Some other artifacts that have been found at the scene, melted glass bottles. That looks maybe like a little tobacco tin, completely melted. All right, the impact on human beings, that they would be carbonized if they were exposed to it and not vaporized, which would basically turn all their body into carbon, like pencil lead, for want of a really naive and basic description. A horrific way to die. People's obviously skin would burn and melt off depending on where they were in location to the bomb. Just an absolutely devastating weapon that shocked the world and has changed the world forever. And obviously we now live in a nuclear age. In everything that happens, we're always worried about this as the ultimate retaliation from somebody. Okay, so again, you can see this photograph on the right is more interesting. That was taken from the Enola Gay, the aircraft that dropped the bomb. That is the mushroom cloud that had flames bursting out of it. Truly something from hell. All right, and then this photograph shows us the impact. A person was standing there, was vaporized, but the flash was so bright that it essentially took a picture and left this shadow of the ladder and the human being. And there's other bits in Hiroshima you can visit. There's on the bridge, there's a fence that you can see that sort of left its shadow and outline. So it's had an impact in all sorts of ways. But for our course, what it's done is it's changed the world. We've just defeated Hitler. World War II is over, but we've now entered a much, much, much worse age with the potential of ending humanity. All right, so as we're just at the beginning of this course, we're not really sure about what's coming yet. If you are watching this as a year 11 revising, then obviously you are well aware of how the Cold War develops, but it's because of this nuclear bomb that it's cold in the first place, remember. All right, so some facts that we might want to consider with this is that 140,000 people or so were killed instantly. 60% of the city's buildings destroyed, and within 5 square miles, the blast radiation has devastated Hiroshima. Now, today, that bomb is child's play, essentially. It can do much, much more damage today. The weapons that all countries, in fact, have access to now in 2025 can do much more damage than this. So this is absolutely its infancy, and the devastation of this bomb is even more scary when you think what the bombs can do today. All right, so President Truman has the ascendancy. He's in charge. He hopes by dropping this bomb that he has the control over what the conference is going to be about. He hopes that he can sort of be the boss of negotiations, and he thinks it's going to be easier to persuade Stalin to do what he wants because Stalin does not yet have this bomb. America is the only country in the world with this power. So Truman believes that there's no way Stalin's not going to follow US demands. But of course, as we've seen, and as we'll go on to see in this Cold War course, it's all tit for tat. Stalin is furious about this bomb being dropped and tested on the second day of Potsdam, and he's furious after the Potsdam conference about the bombing of Japan. So he's going to be thinking that the Soviets now must be more determined than ever to build this buffer zone. This idea of these protective countries, the satellite states, which is next lesson, you'll look at that. To defend Russia. America's got this bomb. First, Russia want to defend itself. That's the argument that Stalin is going to put forward for why he's going to need to take over a lot of the Eastern European countries. But of course, Soviet scientists are going to be working on their version of a bomb as well. So basically, we're beginning the arms race here. So all Truman really has done as part coming into this conference and beyond thinking America could be in total control and in power. He's just angered Stalin, raised animosity, lost a lot of trust, and now Stalin is about to build his own bomb. And that's what's going to lead us into the Cold War officially. So the importance of dropping the bomb cannot be understated for both relations, but also for development of the Cold War, because it has led to an arms race. All right. And then, of course, what we're going to see is Europe is going to be split in two. All of the Eastern European countries under Stalin's control, and Western Europe will be under NATO. So that's how it's going to develop the Cold War going forward. Just a little bit of a brief introduction to the bomb for this online lesson. So let's have a little think about some of the key facts and where we are before we get on to the response. So America's tested its bomb in 1945, as we know, in Potsdam, and then they use it for the first time in war twice. Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, within a couple of days of each other, totally ending the war in Japan and ending World War II officially, which we'd call VJ Day, Victory in Japan. But then their first test in 1949, so 4 years it's taken the Soviets to get theirs. So Stalin has come out and said the sole mission is to build our nuclear arsenal. We will not be bullied or intimidated by the USA. So I don't know if that was what Truman expected to happen, but also at the same time, you can't really sort of criticize Stalin for adopting a more aggressive response, particularly in his defensive approach of the satellite states, which you'll talk about next lesson. And for those of you in Year 11 revising, obviously you'll know that he is going to go on to build this little buffer zone. All right, so that is the situation. That's the tension now, is sort of off the scale with the Grand Alliance. Hanging on by a thread is this idea of a alliance of some sort. And then, of course, by 1964, Britain, France and China also have the bomb as well. And today, as we know, through alliances, everybody has access to nuclear bombs through their allies or themselves. All right, so that is definitely a quick development of the Cold War, following on from the relatively good times of the peace conferences. This will play a part in any negotiation going forward, the idea that there are now nuclear bombs on the table. So before we have a look at some of these, just pause the video and make a list of pros and cons of the nuclear bomb. And then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll carry on and see if you come up with some of the same things that we're going to talk about in the rest of this lesson. Okay, so welcome back. Some of the pros then that we can think about is this is going to be a deterrent for all future wars. Now, as you'll know, watching this in 2025 and hopefully beyond, we've never had World War III, and that's because we know that World War III will use nukes, which will probably be the end of humanity. I think it was once said that World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones, which was essentially alluding to the idea that World War III would be nuclear and all of humanity would have to start again as cavemen. It's good for protection, all right? It's leading the way in science, and lots of positives in that sense. The con of it, though, it can kill millions of people very easily and ultimately will kill all of humanity because each side will have alliances. And as we remember from the first lesson, we introduced the idea of mutually assured destruction. Mad. It could destroy the world many times over, and the consequences don't even bear thinking about. So super severe. All right, so this is where we are. When we think about question 3 in your exam, how important was the Cold War, the atomic bomb on developing the Cold War or relations, then you can clearly see this yellow box sums up that perfectly, and you would obviously need to add a little bit of detail to it. But instead of war, we've now entered this arms race to ensure that one side is always more powerful than the other. All this is doing is adding to tension. So if it's question 1 and it's a consequence, then this is your answer. One consequence is, of course, the raising tensions in the arms race. If it's question 3, then obviously we're going to consider how it's impacting on relations or the development of the Cold War, depending on what it is that they ask. All right, so I would like you now to pause this video and write yourself a little paragraph as if it's question 3. This is especially useful if you are Year 11 watching this in revision. But of course, if you're watching this because you missed the lesson, then everybody else will have done this in class. So can you please write a little paragraph about how it was important for US-Soviet relations? Use the words you can see on the screen, and then obviously hand in anything that you do to get marked. But you can include any other words you want, obviously, but those are the words that you should probably bring up because this is about US-Soviet relations, particularly focus on the breaking down of relations and the lack of trust. When you have done that, unpause the video and then carry on, and we'll move on to what is the biggest consequence probably of all of this, being the telegrams, the communication to both sides, which has developed the Cold War insanely. All right, so rising tensions. One thing we both still agree on is that the breakup of our Grand Alliance might lead to future conflicts. So both sides, somehow, some way, are hanging on to the idea that they should try and remain in the Grand Alliance. But Truman is thinking he needs to know what Stalin's thinking, and then tit for tat, as always, Stalin is now worried and needs to know what Truman's thinking. So the best way to do that would be to set your ambassadors onto this. Now remember that every country has lots of embassies for every other country. This is very similar to the Elizabethan course or Henry VIII if you do Henry VIII in your school. The ambassadors who are in court nowadays, they're not in a court, obviously, of a monarch. They have offices and buildings in probably city centres of each country they are in. This is essentially a way to communicate back to their own countries what's going on, which similarly in the Tudor courses was a way of letting foreign countries know what's happening within other foreign countries. Essentially, folks, it's spying, isn't it? So at least we now know that both sides are paranoid of each other. So these telegrams, these ambassadors are going to step up now and play a huge role. All right. So they have their embassies set up to send back reports of what's going on. And in this period, we would be sending home telegrams. Okay. And they're usually quite short. A few words, just sort of giving a bit of a message. Today, obviously, it would be done by email or text message on the internet, but back then it was done through telegrams. So the first telegram in our story is going to come from Keenan, who is the American ambassador in the embassy in Moscow. So in 22nd of February 1946. With tensions sort of rising a little bit, there's a few Eastern European countries beginning to fall into communist control. So they write this letter, this long telegram. It's called the long telegram because, as I say, normally telegrams are quite short. This one was a little bit longer than the average, so they called it the long telegram in February 46. Read this source and then just maybe make a few notes in your Google Doc or in your book. However you're doing this, what do you think the general message is from Keenan writing back to Washington? When you're ready, unpause the video and then we'll carry on and we'll talk about it a little bit more and see if you picked up the important bits. Okay, so welcome back. So hopefully you picked up by reading this that Keenan is essentially reporting back to America that Russia is not trustworthy, no longer a friend, not an ally, we're not a partner, and we have to essentially stop the Soviet Union spreading communism. All right, that is the gist of what we're talking about here. Soviet policies are going to be cautious, he thinks, though. He doesn't think that the Soviet Union are mad. He uses a term which we'll see in another source in a sec. They're not suicidal. So essentially, Keenan is encouraging Truman now is the time to stop the Soviet Union, whilst they're in no position really to stop us stopping them. So when this telegram is delivered, obviously it's going to became public knowledge and it's going to be reported back to Moscow what's being said in America. But what do you think Truman would think of that? What evidence is there is that Truman should be worried about this telegram coming from Moscow to Washington? All right, again, pause the video while you answer those questions, and then when you're ready, come back and we'll have a little chat in a sec. Okay, so welcome back. Hopefully, again, as we've just talked briefly about it, what should Truman be worried about? It certainly appears, doesn't it, that there's some sort of expansion is going on from the Soviet Union over in Eastern Europe, and Truman is very concerned about that. He should definitely be worried for sure. What would he think about it? Maybe he's already a bit paranoid. He can see that some countries are going communist. So maybe he's going to respond. This next source just sort of shortens the telegram again a little bit. You can see how long it was when it's been shortened to this. It says, we have a political force committed fanatically to the belief that it's desirable and necessary that our traditional way of life be destroyed. So Keenan is telling Truman that the Soviet Union are determined to destroy our way of life, our capitalist way of life, everything we ever believe in. He then goes on to say the international authority of our state be broken if the Soviet power is to be secure. But the problem is within our power to solve without military conflict. He's basically saying that we need to stop the Soviet Union now, as they're going to start challenging our authority in the world. And again, Truman's going to be thinking, okay, this is quite serious, this is quite intense, and there's going to be some response to it. So obviously Moscow is going to deny this is what its intentions are. Moscow is going to say that they are trying to be defensive and build a communist buffer zone against American aggression in Europe. So Obviously, there's a bit of interpretation in these things, and that's always the problem, isn't it? When we interpret things, sometimes we can respond negatively or aggressively. So this was in the 22nd of Feb 1946, and this is a little summary of it, just to get your head around it before we move on. That Stalin wants to see capitalism destroyed is essentially what Keenan's saying. He thinks the West wants to destroy him, but he's not suicidal. If we act now, Stalin will back down. So Truman is going to adopt a very aggressive policy of containment in response to this long telegram. So when we say one consequence of the telegrams, or the long telegram for question 1, your example that you're absolutely going to speak about, not right now if you're watching this for the first time, but if you are watching this in revision, then obviously you're going to look at the Truman Doctrine, which is going to be out shortly following this in response to this apparent threat. All right, so Keenan's long telegram has confirmed Truman's suspicions all along and his paranoia that Stalin wants to destroy capitalism and spread communism west. I'm not sure, even to this day, if that entirely was Stalin's plan, but that is clearly what Truman now believes, thanks to the telegram. So the telegram is really important in now shaping US foreign policy. In that sense, developing the Cold War, it is absolutely vital, significant. So they're the kind of words you want to be thinking about. Okay, so we're going to see very shortly a very aggressive response of containment to stop the spread of communism. Okay, now, of course, as always, there's going to be a response to this. The Novikov telegram, so this is coming from the Soviet ambassador in Washington, writing back to Moscow. As you just previously did with the Keenan source, just pause the video, have a little read of this, and see if you can work out essentially what Novikov is telling Stalin, and think about how that's going to impact their relationship and maybe what Stalin thinks. When you're ready, unpause the video and we'll have a little chat and see if we agree. Okay, so welcome back. This source obviously is going to be talking a little bit about the response that in America, they are building this huge army. And what Novikov is essentially saying to Stalin, and what Stalin is worried about, is why would you need a massive army in peacetime? Basically, what Novikov is telling Stalin is that the Americans are planning an invasion. They're going to come to Europe and they're going to destroy Russia. That is the gist of what Novikov is saying, and Stalin believes it. Just like Truman believed the long telegram from Keenan, this is going to be raising a lot of tensions. So we can see there's going to be a Soviet response. Now, remember, at this point, we know that America is the only country that's got the atomic bomb. So Stalin's response is very limited in that case. He can't do anything aggressively. Not that he's particularly in a position to anyway, having fought in World War II. So he's got to be very careful what he says, because we do have this nuclear bomb that the East don't. So his response is definitely going to be defensive. And as you'll see next lesson, when he starts building up the satellite states, you can clearly see why this telegram has led to his response to that. But then, of course, America are going to say that the Soviet Union are spreading communism. And then you have this tit for tat, back and forth. But the bottom line is, and hopefully you can see that quite clearly, that relations of this Grand Alliance are being stretched to the absolute limit with these two telegrams. All right, so what would Stalin think of it, and what evidence in there might have worried Stalin? Just like we did before with Truman, pause the video, write a few ideas down in relation to that box, and then when you're ready, we'll carry on. All right, so a little summary then of source D in a bit more simple language really than perhaps we've just read in that previous source. The US foreign policy has been characterized in this post-war world as a desire for world domination. Novikov is saying America wants to control the whole world, not just destroy communism and the Soviet Union, but to control the whole world. And that's going to become very clear when America and the Truman Doctrine starts throwing loads of money around Europe in the Marshall Plan, which is coming in the next couple of lessons. It looks to everybody and to Stalin that what Novikov said was going to happen is starting to happen. So you've got to have a little bit of an understanding perhaps of Stalin's paranoia there. But clearly also the long telegram back to Washington clearly suggested that Russia is going to try and spread communism and destroy our way of life. It looks to Truman, that he is taking over one country at a time and spreading it across Europe. So a lot's being said, a lot's being seen, a lot's happening, and they sort of are able to fit all of that into these two telegrams. And I'm really just re-emphasizing the point here of how important these telegrams actually are for the development of the Cold War. All right, so this source goes on to say all these steps to preserve the great military potential are not an end to itself, of course. They are intended only to prepare conditions to win global domination. In other words, we need to now get defensive, all right, and stop this American imperialism, which is an American empire building. That's what they're accusing America of planning to do, build a huge empire. All right, so to summarize then, we've seen, just as we saw with the telegram, the American one, the USA wants to use its massive military power to destroy the Soviet Union. Now that Roosevelt is dead, the USA does not want to work with us anymore. The American people are happy to go to war. That's what Novikov and Stalin are coming to the conclusion of. We must protect ourselves. The best way to do that, and that is to build up these satellite states, which you'll see next lesson as a bit of a buffer zone to protect Russia. All right, so you decide perhaps now, again, as a historian, sometimes we can get bogged down in having to try and revise and learn for exams. But as historians doing this course, especially in the world that we live in today, perhaps just pause the video and just have a think to yourself about who's right, who's wrong. Is anyone right or wrong? We'll do these little sort of reflections as we go through this Cold War course. But it's always interesting just to try and see different perspectives too, and try to understand the bigger picture. That is, after all, why you picked to choose study history. Okay, so tension summary then before we look at the consequences of this. So Truman believes the USSR doesn't trust Truman. That's true. Stalin wants to see the destruction of capitalism, and we're building up their military to do that. That's what he believes. Stalin is paranoid of the rest of the world. It's probably true as well, but no different to Truman being paranoid of them. And the Soviet Union was not suicidal, so USA could force Stalin to back down quite easily, and that they're going to adopt this new policy of containment to contain and stop the spread of communism around the world. So that's what's come as a result of these telegrams. On the flip side, obviously, he believes, Stalin, that the USA doesn't trust them. He believes, thanks to Novikov's telegram, that the United States wants to use their massive new peacetime military to dominate the world, to build empires. And they're also worried that since Roosevelt has died, the USA is no longer willing to cooperate with the Soviet Union. That was clear, wasn't it, in Potsdam, that there was a definite shift in relations. And they're also worried that the American people would support their government in a war. They're ready for this. Bear in mind, the Americans didn't just fight 5 long years in World War II. So they now need to know, Stalin's belief is that they need to protect themselves in developing this buffer zone. So that is the direct consequence of the telegrams. It's led to two sides coming up with a brand new policy. The Americans you're going to see is going to be the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, and the satellite states are going to be the Soviets' response. So how might this look in an exam? I'm going to just give you a little bit of a chance to have a look at a fairly good answer, a model answer here for this question 3, and it would be how important were the telegrams for developing the Cold War? But you could equally substitute the tag of this question, development of the Cold War, for international relations, or again, relations between the Soviet Union and America. So when you see this, I'll put 2 paragraphs on. You can obviously pause the video to read them at your leisure. This is the kind of paragraph or 2 that you need to be producing in this kind of question. So you can read it yourself, but what I do want to point you out to in these 2 little paragraphs are the red writing. They are essentially examples of where we are referring back to the question throughout the paragraphs. We need to be doing that at least 2 or 3 times in the whole answer, 2 paragraphs, or there's no real structure to this question. Just make sure you have enough detail that can get you your 8 marks. Okay, so in this case we've got sort of 2 paragraphs. I've chose the first paragraph to be related to the US, and then the second paragraph to be more focused on the Soviet telegram and their response. But I keep hopefully trying to get back to the words of the question using the words of the question, especially you can see in red we've got some connectives in there as well, and we've also got some content and knowledge too about what the telegrams are saying. So read this to yourself. Hopefully that will make it perfectly clear what question 3 kind of looks like. It's just a lovely opportunity for you to say that it's important or significant or whatever it is. But remember, for this question, we are saying why something is important for something else. Just slightly different from question 1, where you just need to give a consequence, still using connectives and still obviously using your knowledge. In this case, your knowledge and your explanation has to be absolutely critically related back to the words of the question, the second half of the question. In this case, development of the Cold War, but equally could be relations. All right, so pause the video, have a good read of that, and then when you're ready, we'll carry on and we'll draw a bit of a close to this lesson by letting Winston Churchill have a little bit of a say in what's going on. So when you're ready, unpause and we'll carry on. All right, welcome back. So the British perspective on all of this is quite unique. You shouldn't be surprised that it's going to be obviously pro-American because of our general alliance with America. So Winston Churchill is going to get himself back on the scene. Now, obviously, he lost the election and was replaced at Potsdam by Clement Attlee. But he's still a very influential political figure, all right? Absolutely no longer prime minister, but super respected, very experienced. And he delivers this speech in March 1946, so just after the long telegram was received. He visits America and he basically says that Russia are split in Europe. Okay, this has become a defining moment in relations. All right, so this is kind of a little bit of an abridged of what Churchill said in this speech. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent of Europe. Behind that line lie all the capitals of all the ancient states. All are subject in one form or other, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. So what he's basically saying here is that Stalin has split Europe, east and west. There's a metaphorical curtain. When he talks about an iron curtain, that's the words he used. That's a metaphor. Obviously, there isn't a massive metal curtain in Europe, but he has basically said, thanks to Stalin's aggression and spreading communism, Europe is now split in east and west. Now, that is also going to add to Truman's paranoia and fears following the telegram from Keenan that says as much is happening, whereas obviously Stalin is saying that he is trying to build a buffer zone of protection. Now, at the time of this speech, remember that we haven't had the Novikov telegram just yet, but what this has done is this has infuriated Stalin even more, and Stalin has basically said to Churchill, the old Grand Alliance, remember they were once an ally, you've chose America's side, it's very clear where we stand, and this is just another example of being ganged up on by the West. This is Stalin's general go-to, is that we're always being ganged up on by the West. And when we get onto the Berlin story in a couple of lessons' time, or if you're watching this as your revision, obviously we know that Stalin feels ganged up on in there with Bisonia and Trisonia. It's just another example of where Stalin's paranoia has led to a policy. All right, so Churchill getting himself involved, delivering this speech is iconic, the Iron Curtain speech, because it's basically said now, look what Stalin's doing over in Europe, America, you need to do something to stop this. So reinforcing this aggressive response from Truman. So in this source that you can see on the screen now, just pause the video and write down as much as you can see and what you think's going on in this source. It's one of the most famous sources from the Cold War, or certainly the early Cold War period. It shows this curtain, if you like. You can see on the top of it, it's like got a curtain pole. Just write down what you think you can see, what you think's going on. There's loads. You probably write about half a page on this at least. Look at the text, look at the words, look at Europe being split. What do you think's going on the other side? Look at the top of the curtain, etc. Look at maybe some of the damage. What does that represent on the western side? Considering as well, just for Berlin being an issue, remember that Berlin is in the Soviet zone, as agreed at Yalta, and then at Potsdam they agreed to split Berlin. This is the main reason, probably, as we develop on this Cold War course, you'll see why Berlin becomes so important and why under no circumstances is the West going to give up Berlin, because it's our eye into the east. It's our only way of seeing essentially underneath of this curtain. So have a little go writing down some of the things you can see. Most of it's really obvious, but just taking that time to reflect on what the message of this source is trying to say, with Churchill just at the bottom trying to peer underneath. All right, when you're ready, just move on and we'll draw a close to this lesson. All right, so this is kind of where we are after the atomic bomb and the telegrams and all of the tension and basically the end of the Grand Alliance, is that Stalin is saying, it's clear, Churchill, you too have abandoned our alliance as well. You've confirmed what I already knew. The West is determined to undermine me. All trust is gone. You want to play tough? Let's play tough. So Stalin is feeling, again, ganged up on. As we've said, this goes on throughout the whole course, especially in the next bit of Berlin, where Bisonia and Trisonia is created. For you, year 11 watching this, that will make a bit more sense to you than if you're just watching this because you missed the lesson in class. But that's how Stalin's feeling, and his response is obviously always going to be defensive to that, which is where we'll be next lesson with the creation of the satellite states. So with that said, this is the visual to finish on today of what Churchill's talking about, this Iron Curtain, this metaphorical split east and west. You can clearly see where it split Europe from the east, from the west, okay? And that's where most of the Cold War is going to play out. Eventually, the Western countries are going to join the new NATO, which is an aggressive agreement and pact almost, which is what Russia are most concerned about. And of course, you'll have a Soviet response. So hopefully this lesson has ironed out a few concerns for you if you're watching this in revision. And if you're watching this because you missed the lesson, hopefully that's made it very clear what's generally happened. But what we're talking about here is the end of the Grand Alliance, and now all future policies are going to be directly impacted by what we've learned in this lesson. The bomb has changed everything. The telegrams have changed policy. We'll have the Truman Doctrine shortly, and then of course the creation of the satellite states, and then both sides will end up with these nuclear bombs, and the rest, as they say, will be history. If you do have any questions on this topic, or of course anything else, please just tell your teacher. All lessons are available on stchistory.com in the GCSE section. Thank you very much once again for joining us, and we'll see you for the next video. All right, thank you very much, and goodbye.